Great. So welcome everyone to another in our webinar series. The topic today is Day in the Life of an Administrator. So not so much feature function focus of OpenAir, but more of how to support the system, maintain the system, and when you are called an OpenAir administrator, what does that really mean? What we'll start off with, though, is let you know some of the things that are happening at Top Step that you're welcome to participate in, and that is the user groups. So where we're at as far as the user groups this year, there is actually one this Friday, tomorrow, in Austin, and then we have a little bit of a break because May is focused on SuiteWorld. So we are a gold sponsor at SuiteWorld, so if any of you are planning to go, we hope that you stop by our booth in the expo and say hi. We'll also have people sitting in the PSA track if you have any questions for us. And then the user groups will start back up in June. I think we have 3 in June. So it's a little hard to schedule around May timeframe, so that's SuiteWorld, and then the user groups will be in June. And then we are still having the webinar series every month, so we are having it on May 15th, which is the last day of SuiteWorld actually. So it's a little bit of a scheduling conflict there, but we'll still have the OpenAir Expert Webinar Series, and our May topic will be Resource Management Model Comparison, centralized versus decentralized, the pros and cons of those approaches, and of course feature functionality use in the system and permission sets. So a really great topic, something that I know comes up quite often in our user groups, talking about resource management in OpenAir. But today's topic is about the life of an administrator. So what we're going to go through is sort of see if anyone identifies with some of the topics we're going to talk about here as an administrator. What are you faced with on a daily basis? What your role is in the organization? And then just kind of step through what the many hats are of a system administrator and give you some tips and tricks on how to make your life easier in that role. It doesn't have to be you holding the whole burden on your shoulders. There can be power users identified, ways to set up the system to make it a little bit more maintainable, and definitely lots of documentation and help desk structure in and outside of OpenAir will help you be able to maintain the system and communicate with end users very frequently. So with that, let's go through what a typical day is for a system administrator. So you walk in and somebody sends you an email saying, who's generating my invoices? And then the next email that comes in says, oh, we have a new hire. So we have to do some onboarding. Can you set up the new person? Can you do the training? And then while you're doing that, another one comes in saying, where's my project to put on my timesheet? I can't find the project. I saw it last week, or my project manager told me I had to work on it. Why can't I see it on my timesheet? I really need to get my time in for last week because it's already late. And then while you're troubleshooting that, another one comes in and says, I can't access the workspace that houses all this critical project information, all my documentation. So you're like, okay, I'll get back to that. And then another one comes in saying, do you have any documentation I can read? Anything on like the user guides on how I'm supposed to set up a project? So you get the gist of what happens in a day in an administrator, and it just goes on and on, right? You're getting all of these emails saying, hey, I need a new project. I can't get stuff on my timesheet. A contract just got signed. Someone needs to set the project up. I need a report. The report that is in the standard folder doesn't quite meet my needs. I need it specialized for what I do. How do I edit my own report? Then somebody locks themselves out, and you get the email that locked them. Oh, can you reset my password? I can't modify this form. I need to make a change to this task. The task name is not right. How can I change it myself? And then, of course, the big one is, oh, it's around October, November time frame. In January, we're going to just reorganize the whole organization. So departments, hierarchies, cost centers, all that kind of stuff. So this, you probably are probably nodding your head at this point saying, yeah, that's pretty much what happens every day. And there's a lot on your plate as an administrator. And there's a lot of questions, and the questions come from all different directions. They come from simple troubleshooting, resetting my password, to, hey, I need a new margin analysis report to put on my dashboard so I can bring that to the executive meeting that we have on a quarter-end basis. So a wide gamut of information is handled by an administrator. And you actually are wearing a lot of different hats in the organization. So who are you as an administrator? What is your actual role when you say you're an OpenAir administrator? It's a pretty loose term. I like to say you're a data administrator because in many cases you're either doing or supporting the people who are setting up the new users as new hires or new clients or setting up projects. So you fall into sort of a business or a project administrator role. Sometimes you cover a little bit of HR. And then if you have integrations, of course, that could all be, you're verifying that the data that came across in the integration is correct. You're also the customer support rep. So you may be first contact for a lot of the people in the organizations where people are having trouble, they can't save a form because they have to fill in a field and they don't know what to fill in, or they have general questions, or they lock themselves out. So you're sort of tier 1. If you're a power user, you're probably the go-to person in the office to ask questions about the system versus people going to like the IT help desk or maybe even the NetSuite support. You're also the customer service desk. So you're the one that's maintaining the integrity of the reports that are in place, making sure the reports are set up right. People need to get access to more information in the system. You're sort of the stop gate or the hurdle to make sure that that person is granted access if they're supposed to have it, and if they're not supposed to have it, then you don't grant it. So you're the person that's sort of making those decisions. It's not errors and questions. It's more of, you want to be able to run a utilization report across the whole company. Well, if you're a subcontractor, that's probably not the right permission set for you. And then finally, you actually are the system administrator. So you're the one that's learned all those switches and checkboxes and settings and controls and the dreaded internal switch list that people talk about a lot when you're working on configuring OpenAir. So you're aware of the configuration changes, and you're aware of the ripple effect of the configuration changes. So you sort of have to do change control and make sure that the system is kept at whole and you're not impacting business processes by changing certain system configurations. So these are a lot of different hats that you're wearing. Data administrator, customer support, customer service, system administrator. So I like to just use a general term and call it you're the general use and reference user for OpenAir, or guru. So OpenAir administrators become gurus because you really have to. You cover a lot of different areas, a lot of different responsibilities, and you touch a lot of the organization as it comes to OpenAir, because it is one of those systems. It doesn't do just one thing. It does a lot of different things that all mesh together, and that ends up touching things like sales and accounting and HR and people's compensation and management reporting and strategic vision analysis. So as an administrator, you actually end up filling a lot of these roles, and it's a big responsibility, and we understand the challenge a lot of people have with this. So let's dive into each of the hats and see if you see some similarities here, and then we'll talk about some tips and tricks on how to make sure that you can wear these hats or pass those hats along or empower other people to help with the daily activities that happen as a system administrator. So as a data administrator, the size of the organization tends to drive who owns data entry. So if you're in a very large organization, usually there's pockets of people that own specific pieces of the puzzle. If you have sort of a project administration staff, they're usually the ones that set up the project. If you're using invoicing or revenue in the system, they're the ones that are setting up the rules according to the contracts. And then you have maybe HR is the one that's creating user accounts in the system as part of the onboarding process. If you have, you may have a central resource management team. They're the ones that are scheduling people to do the work on projects. Project managers may be responsible for setting up the tasks on a project. So sometimes there's a delegation of ownership in the system. So it's not just one person. It's sort of the role that you play in the company is also the role and ownership of the data you have in the system. And that's what I usually see in large organizations, where there is sort of a spreading of the wealth, so to speak, so that everyone has an opportunity to work in the system and own part of the system. And then the coordination of that is the tricky part, and that's as you as a system administrator or a guru end up falling into that sort of central coordination role. You're the one that's aware of everyone's responsibilities in the system, and then you're also the one that's sort of coordinating among those different responsibility roles to make sure if there's any kind of change control, change management, system issues that you're working with that team. But if you're in a smaller organization, it may just be you. You could be the central person that's doing all the project setup, doing all the person setup, writing all the reports for people. It really depends on the size of the organization, obviously. So as a data administrator, you're either hands-on doing the data administration or you're coordinating that data administration, and most likely you're doing some kind of auditing or monitoring of the information in this role. Now, the data administrator, I would also stretch into the interfaces. So if you have built or have existing interfaces to the OpenAir or from the OpenAir system, whether it's using some kind of integration tool, maybe it's the integration manager tool from NetSuite, maybe it's a standard interface that comes like the NetSuite OpenAir interface. Whatever tools, or you've built something with APIs, whatever tools are in place, whatever integrations are in place, as a system administrator, you've probably been involved in the design of that integration and are keenly aware of the constraints, limitations, dependencies of the data to be able to be used in those integrations. For example, if you have an invoice interface to your accounting system, is OpenAir responsible for passing over the bill to and ship to contact information, or is that the responsibility of the accounting system? That was probably something that was decided in the design, and so you know what you have to do inside the system to be able to support whatever final decision that was. Yes, it's required that they be on there. Okay, great, I have to make these fields required fields, and then train people when they're reviewing and approving invoices that they're keenly aware of what those values should be, or they have to be populated before the invoice is approved. So just because there's an interface and it's connecting systems together and you may not have written the interface, you still have to be aware of it to support it, because from a data administrator perspective, you'll be the one end up troubleshooting on the OpenAir side should there be any issues. Now, moving to the customer support hat, so what do you have to deal with here? So I like to call this the most important role for system adoption. A system administrator, OpenAir administrator, you do get a lot of questions, hey, can you reset my password, which is a pretty simple task to do. But what you don't realize is that if you are in this customer support, this OpenAir administrator role, you are actually one of the drivers for people wanting to use the system. Responsiveness is key. So if a question comes in, an issue comes in, a complaint comes in even, you have to be responsive. You want to be able to talk to that person, respond to that, similar like a ticketing system if you have it, or just simply email. But acknowledge the fact that you did receive that, and if you happen to know what the answer is right away, great, give it to them. Otherwise, let them know what the progress is as you're working on the issue for closure. People want, when they're using a new system like this, if there's not a go-to place for frequently asked questions or a knowledge base or something, they want to know that their questions are being worked on, right? So definitely, if you're in this system administrator role, this guru role, you're the one that's kind of on the point to answer the questions through email. So email responsiveness is very important because people feel that they're being heard and that they'll be able to interact with the system in a more positive manner if they know someone's out there to help them. I would have to say a lot of people ask us, what's the best way to learn OpenAir? And of course, NetSuite has the Essentials course. We certainly have report workshops and an administrative training course. But I have to say, hands down, the best way to learn OpenAir is to be on the front line, to be in this customer support role, because you're going to get those questions, it could be very simple questions, it could be really far out questions. Why is my forecast doesn't look quite right when I'd used booked and worked hours on my charge projections? And some of you know what I'm talking about, and some of you are like, well, I haven't had that question yet. But you learn the system really well because you're challenged to try to find the answer to even areas that you may not know about the system. And this is also the place where you have the opportunity to not only learn about the system, but to document and provide that information source to other people so that they can go look up the answers for themselves. Frequently asked questions, I think, are something that a lot of customers may forget about doing. People just sort of know what the answer is, so they're willing to send that in email. But if you haven't stopped to sort of build a frequently asked questions page, document, repository somewhere in the system, think about doing that at some point in time, because you can answer a lot of questions that are being asked simply by providing that source out there. I know when I use Microsoft Excel and all kinds of other tools, I'm clicking on that question button every now and then because I just don't want to do a quick search. I don't want to submit a ticket into the customer support desk. I know I can find it somewhere. I just have to know where to look. So what are the type of questions that you usually get? They could range from basic, which is I locked myself out, and if you've used the system for a really long time, you've sort of followed the evolution of even just the lockout functionality in OpenAir, where they've tried to make it a little more self-service friendly. Back in the day, before they had the unlock your password functionality, it was, you could save a hint, it would email you your hint, and hopefully that was enough to give you what your password was. And now they have a series of security questions, and if you're not familiar with that, there is a functionality or a feature in the system that you basically can give people the opportunity to set 3 security questions, and then if they do lock themselves out, they can go through an unlock process by answering those 3 questions, and the system will unlock the person themselves. So that was one of those nice enhancements that, from an end user perspective, a system administrator perspective, that feature was a big hit because it sort of resolved some of the basic questions an OpenAir administrator would have to deal with on a daily basis. And so things like that are features that, as a system administrator, you could look at and see what would make my job easier and still provide good service to the end users. Now the complicated questions, I usually like to say reports. I know nobody likes to hear that reports are complicated, but if you're using reports in OpenAir, they're complicated. And there's so many features now, especially with custom calculations regarding what you can and can't do with the reports. It is complicated, and even people that have gone through like a report training session will most likely be wanting additional help. They're thinking they can get something by just picking X, Y, and Z fields, and that may be logical. But if you pick something like project assignments, you just want to understand the hours that people are supposed to be working based on project assignments or task assignments, and you're not actually assigning people to tasks, you're using bookings. Well, that's just people don't understand that that's not a standard field that's going to work for you. So the reports are probably the biggest headache, I would think, for customer support in the guru role, because it could be anything. It could be something that you can do in the system. It could be something that you have to create custom calculations for. But those are the more complicated questions, and those are the ones that it tends to drive you to learn a lot about the database, a lot about the system, and a lot about what the reports can and can't do. So a lot of times we're, Top Step, some of you may be working with us as your help desk. It's one of the services that we do offer our clients. And one of the things that comes up, and we try to make sure we have some kind of guidelines around this, is how to handle access requests, especially when it comes to reports. So when people log into the system, about 80% of your people are probably just time and expense users. They log in, they go to their timesheet. If they can't find the project, they're emailing you. But if they can, they just put their timesheet in and they're fine. If they start getting measured on things like utilization and accomplishment of targets and compensation-based analysis that's coming from the tool, then they're going to want to see reports in the system. And usually there are a series of self-service reports that we help customers stand up so that people can do self-monitoring. Am I going to hit my target this quarter or not? But sometimes you get the request of, can I see the profitability of this project? Can I do a profitability report of a project? And that's always a tricky one because that's an access problem. When you think in terms of profitability of a project, it literally means how much money have we earned versus what's the cost of the service to deliver it. And at a roll-up level for a whole project, if that person's a project manager, then yes, most likely they should be able to see the profitability of the project. Okay? But profitability is a bit tricky because profitability also means that you can see cost, not just expense cost, but labor cost. So should PMs be able to see individual person labor cost? If the answer is yes, great. It's an easy report to put in place. If the answer is no, now you're in a bit of a quandary because in order to get a roll-up profitability report at the project level without seeing any detail underneath it, you still need to be able to see the detail information. So these are the kind of questions that we'll get from customers, or when I was in the role of an administrator, before I started TopStep, I was in this role. I would get these questions saying, I really need this kind of report. I need to do margin analysis. I need a profitability report. I need to see the utilization for the entire department. And my first question is always, should they be granted access to this information? It's very simple to give people access, but the bigger question and the more difficult question is, should they have the access? And then when you're asking the question, should they have the access, you really have to ask, well, why do they need it? If they're a practice director or a vice president, yes, most likely they need the information to do their analysis and their daily job and their decision making on staffing and where the company's going. So yes, of course they should have the access. If it's a subcontractor that's playing the role of a project manager in your organization, that one's tricky because you don't want to expose information that's company confidential to a subcontractor, but then again, if they're a project manager, they may need to do some level of project management, and you're holding them to things like margin, for example. So that one, you end up having to get a little bit more information about what they need and why they need it. And then if the access request is making a change to the configuration, you really need to think about, okay, it's easy to check a box. All of us know how to check a box and hit the Save button or uncheck a box. But what does that box mean and what's the ripple effect in the organization? It could be that it makes everyone's life easier, which would be the most wonderful switch ever. It could be that there's a ripple effect that you didn't think about, that now it's hampering the business process you're trying to enforce. Think of things like a timesheet alert. We set up a timesheet alert and we forget to check the box that says only limit this to people who have a timesheet that are required. So now the email is going out 2 or 3 times a week to everyone that has a user account in OpenAir, and you as an administrator are getting all of those complaints saying, well, you know, I'm not required to put my timesheet in every week. Why am I getting this, especially your subcontractors? So that you go back and you fix it. But by now the damage is done. There's sort of people are ignoring the emails now because they're like, well, it's just one of those emails that comes from OpenAir. So you really want to think about when you make changes to the configuration, will there be an impact on the business process, the communication effectiveness of the system, and just ripple effect of usability of the system in general. You by default become an enforcer of the business processes that you have stood up in the system. So not only are you configuring the system, doing data migration and training people on it, you have an ongoing role to make sure that people are following the processes you guys put in place. If people should be scheduled before they're supposed to put time in, then you're monitoring and making sure that people are getting scheduled before time is in, because that's critical to forecasting. Okay? So you do become, in this customer support role, you become the business process policy enforcer, I like to call it. Then, of course, the actual system administration hat. So all this point in time, you've been answering questions, trying to figure out if people should have access. But then there is just normal maintenance things that have to happen in the system. And we've covered those in a couple of our webinars previously. Things like release management. The releases are now 4 times a year, and they come packed full of useful features that may or may not apply to your account. So you'll want to look at those releases and make sure you understand what can and can't be taken advantage of. And then, of course, the timing of when to roll those new features out. So you'll want to understand whether you need to, many of customers that we work with have run into we stood up OpenAir, we just did real basic project management, timesheets and expenses. Now we want to start getting into forecasting. Forecasting usually means resource management, resource scheduling. So let's roll out the resource module and start getting scheduling processes in place. And now let's do our forecasting. So there's usually sort of an ongoing evolution of your configuration as you expand the functionality of the system. And then the one thing that inevitably will happen is the organization structure is going to change. You may have different service lines offerings or service offerings. They start calling different departments. You combine departments, split departments up, start up offices in other regions, decide you don't want east and west, you want north and south. So organization changes are something that as a system administrator, it's just a fact of life, and you'll have to figure out what's the best way to manage that in the system. And we have an end of year webinar that we usually do, which gives you tips and tricks on how to sort of stand the system up to accommodate sort of the ever-changing organization. Ways to make it a little bit easier to maintain so that you're not impacting historical reports negatively, but be able to react quickly when the organization change does actually happen in the company. And then, of course, supporting the interfaces. Interfaces are a way to not only support data flow, but process flow as you connect systems together. And when the flow stops, there's usually a problem. There's a ripple effect of missing data in the other systems, whether it's inside OpenAir or inside another receiving system. And so you end up filling that role of troubleshooting, making sure that you can handle whatever the issues are and document what the typical issues are so that there's always frequently asked questions for your IT folks on how to resolve any issues that come up. So those are the hats that usually come up being a guru. So you're answering questions, you're making sure that the data looks clean, you're administrating the system, making sure that you're taking advantage of new feature functionality. And then on top of that, you're really the key communicator to the organization. You're making sure that people are aware of when the system is changing, why it's changing, and how does it impact them. What kind of training materials are needed, and frequently asked question information. You'll end up being the person that is helping people understand when things are changing and making those announcements along the way. So the guru hat, I like to say, you're sort of, at the end of the day, you're informing people too. You're responding, but you're informing as well. So now everyone's wondering, well, okay, so great. I know my job is really hard, so how do you make my life easier? So I like to say, make sure you structure OpenAir in a way that's easy to maintain. Try not to do a lot of unique configurations and set-offs. Specifically, I'm talking about roles and filter sets. So there are many reasons why things start getting complicated very quickly in large organizations, especially where you have sort of a group, perhaps offshore group, that has to have limited access to certain things, and then you have somebody in the U.S. that has more permissions to do things, and then you have different departments that are interacting, HR and finance versus the services group, and you start thinking, okay, well, let me create an offshore role, and let me create a time role for the U.S., and let me create an HR role. Oh, let me create a finance role. So you start automatically thinking about buckets of what people do, and start setting up roles for that. When in fact you don't have to set up special roles for everyone. You can have more generic roles and control access to functions and features by simply not giving people certain modules. If you're an offshore person that's only supposed to be doing time, maybe you have a more robust project manager role, except you don't have the projects module, so you can't do anything related to the projects management. So thinking of ways to keep things as streamlined as possible in the system is a good way to help the maintenance level. If you end up with a company with 100 people and you have 47 roles, you probably are not streamlined in the system. 5 roles, 6 roles, I've seen as many 10 roles are probably enough to meet all of the needs of all of the organization, no matter how big it is. The filter sets, on the other hand, are a whole other complication because sometimes you have to set up filter sets by geographies. especially if you're an international company. You may have to have filter set control over which expense items I'm allowed to use. Meals works in the U.S., but in the UK it has to be breakfast, lunch, and dinner or something like that. And that's understandable. The filter sets could actually grow to be quite large, but filter sets also add a complication because if you're familiar with user setup in the system, you can actually use not just a primary filter set, but an override for each module. So things get complicated very quickly. So making sure you have sort of clear documentation on a minimized set of roles, a minimized set of filter sets, driven by potentially access to certain expense items or certain project stages, and then just the marrying of those two simple roles into a matrix of user setup will be complicated enough without making each of those independent lists much more complicated. So focus on streamlining and simplifying as much as you can, because the combination of feature functionality will get complicated quickly. Okay. The other thing we recommend, and we did do a webinar on this last year, was report maintenance, report management. Set up a standard set of reports for everyone to be using. Most people like to be able to control their own destiny. They want their own set of reports, but have them start with a standard report that's already configured with the right values that make sense and the right filtering and the right subtotaling. And they can control things like, I only want my users, or I want a different time frame. If you give people standard reports, you will avoid people using, I used my report, you used your report, we went to the meeting together and our numbers didn't match, and they should have. You'll avoid that kind of data questioning because you have a standard set that people are working off of. And then keep in touch with departments in your organization. I call out HR and accounting finance specifically because those are usually the ones that their changes happen that impact OpenAir. HR from an organization perspective, a new hire or termination perspective, accounting finance from maybe a contract terms or billing activity, revenue recognition policy change, maybe a general ledger account structure change. Those things will impact the way that OpenAir is set up and OpenAir is being used. So making sure that you're in the loop with them will make your life easier because you'll know what's coming. You'll have an idea of what's coming and you'll be able to plan for it as far as maintenance in the system. Another general item that you, as an administrator, you fall into is that you really should be monitoring the system usage and the data accuracy. So system usage is more like audit reports. A great report that really everyone should have is license usage. It's really a user detail audit report that includes fields like last login, last time entry, last receipt date, last scheduling or booking entry date. So you have an idea of whether this person is either actively being used or actively using the system. And if they're not actively using the system in the last month, 2 months, or so forth, inactivate the user. All of their data is still there, but it frees up a license. And licenses are gold when you have OpenAir because you have a limited number of those licenses that you're paying for, and you want to be able to make sure that you're being cost effective in the use of those licenses. But other key audit reports that you may or may not have are things like, are projects set up correctly? Sort of a loaded question, I know, but are projects set up correctly? Because there could be very key fields that need to be filled in. I know everyone on the phone here probably already realizes that there's things called form permissions that allow you to basically identify fields that are required. Maybe there's new enhancements now to say you can limit values in certain fields based on other fields or create some error reports. There's a lot of nice expansion to the form permission functionality in OpenAir to make it a little more of a smart form. That's obviously still a work in process. But no matter how well you do those form permissions, things may happen. Things may not go as planned. There are ways to sort of inadvertently circumvent the form permission rule. When you make a change on a form and you save it, that's when the rules are run. But many of you are probably aware of options like run in action, where you can just do a mass change of on resource bookings, mass change the booking type, or on a project, mass change all of these projects, make them all inactive, or make them all moved into the active stage versus the pipeline stage. Those run-in actions do not run the form permission. So you could be changing a project from one stage to another, and that stage action should trigger some other kind of events to happen on the properties form of a project. If you're not on the properties form on the project when you change a stage, none of those events can happen, and that's what leads to data problems in the system. So having a project audit report to make sure that the fields are set up correctly according to the stage that they're in, that rules are in place to make sure invoicing and revenue happen, very useful information. Same type of thing for user setup, making sure that when users are coming in, especially if you have an automated user creation process, if you have some kind of import process, making sure that you have a user audit report to make sure that everything is complete on how the user's been set up. Their cost center is right, their manager is right, their job code's right, things like that. Very important because automation works to a point, but if data is missing in the import feed, it probably did not throw an error. And then the other thing that you're doing is not only watching data accuracy, but you're also watching for policy compliance. So things like you can run the timesheet status report and find out how many people are behind on timesheets. And you can do that on a weekly basis and sort of get a trending on, everyone's waiting until the end of the month. So forecasting or pending billings are not going to be accurate until the end of the month because everyone waits until the end of the month to put their timesheets in. You start seeing human behavior reflected when you're doing data reviews in the system. And things like resource scheduling. Are people being scheduled for projects because that may impact your forecasting? So monitoring the system by setting up some standard reports that feed you information, maybe on an automated basis through emails that you can just quickly open, look to see what what's happening and sort of glean information, will give you a lot of insight into how to make life easier or more increase adoption for the system for your end users. So here at TopStep, we like to, when you think in terms of an OpenAir administrator, we do like to make sure that there's actually a central owner. It doesn't have to be one person, but when we say central owner, there has to be at least a sponsor, a person who owns the system, a department that owns the system, that is responsible for making decisions about how that system is going to continue to evolve and support the organization as time goes on. So sometimes that falls to a single person, sometimes it falls to the services organization, sometimes it falls to IT, but there is somebody who owns the system. And being a SaaS model tool, a lot of times it may be a business person because there isn't a lot of programming or anything that has to happen. So it could be a person, a project manager, a project administrator, a business operations person, could be the owner of the system. And that's fine because it's basically a checkbox system for configuration, and really understanding the processes that are supported by OpenAir are the main part of owning the system. But if you're in a large organization where you can't have sort of a single contact or a single focus, what you'll want to do is set up sort of a hierarchy of ownership. We work with many customers who have multiple subsidiaries or multiple offices in a global environment. Each of those offices or subsidiaries has a power user, one or more power users. Those are the go-to people for that local office. The people in that office know who that power user is, and if that power user needs help, they turn to a third party. Maybe it's us, maybe it's NetSuite, to help with with the support actions if there's questions they can't handle. So even if you delegate administration responsibility down, there still has to be a funnel up internally because there really needs to be a change control head that owns the system. Make sure you have a help desk or site available, maybe a knowledge base available for people to go to find questions and get answers to their questions. I worked with some customers who we've used the Workspaces module inside OpenAir, and we've loaded documentation, reference documentation into the Workspaces. Of course, that means you have to be able to get into the system to find it, but once you get past that hurdle, it's there, and you can do quick reference links to web pages and to the workspace itself to be able to get to the information. Many of you may have a filing system, maybe it's something like a SharePoint. Stand up a site in SharePoint that has a list of who are your local power users, who are, what are the FAQs, where's the training material, where's the quick reference cards, where's some change control documentation or announcements on what's happening in the system. People will help themselves. And so if you provide that guidance to them, give them that information, they'll be able to look up a lot of their own answers and be able to learn the system even better themselves. And then funnel questions through a central or local context. So this is where sort of the local power user versus the central ownership structure is. When you're on that front line, I like to say you will learn the system very well. So your power users or your, some people will call it Tier 1 support people in the different offices or even departments will be the people that can answer a lot of the low-hanging fruit questions, so to speak. Password resets, how do I create a timesheet, things like that. And then we all know that the releases now come out quarterly. And so my general guideline is the releases come out and they usually have some really good information in them, and you want to implement those changes. So roll up any kind of ongoing general system maintenance into a much bigger sort of do your own internal release management. You could be wanting to roll out resource scheduling and a new business process related to resource scheduling where you qualify whether someone is tentatively booked or committed to this project. And instead of implementing that on Thursday and then the following week implementing a bunch of new features from the release, if the timing is right, logically group them together so that you have sort of one release internally saying, here's the new release of OpenAir. We have implemented this and this and this that impacts you this way and that way. Here's the process changes. Here's the new reports available. Basically do internal release management, and that will give you that change control and communication to the end users. Also, you'll want to set up an administrator calendar. So when do you do certain things on a regular basis? Those audit processes I talked about. When are you going to do the audits? Weekly, monthly, maybe quarterly? If you're doing something with custom time ranges that require a weekly change, make sure you make a note on a weekly basis. I have to go and clean this up in the system or change this in the system. On an annual basis, setting up the holidays in the calendar, for example, to make sure that all the PTO or the company holidays are reflected correctly in timesheets. There is a structure to be an administrator, so go ahead and set that calendar up so people are aware of when things are going to happen on a regular basis. And then areas to sort of rely on for additional information yourself. Many of you know about the OpenAir Users LinkedIn group. Definitely, kind of watch that group. There are a lot of people that have tips out there. They'll throw questions out there. Jump in, answer a question or two, ask a question or two yourself. It's really a user community forum for us to be able to share information with each other and to ask the questions that, how has everyone solved, this problem typically, and get some really good advice from just fellow users of the system. And of course, top step, we recommend you guys listen to our webinars because we hope that they actually have a lot of useful information. And if you're not aware of it, we also do have tips books. There's 2 ebooks that have over 50 tips each on sort of usability of the system, maybe things that quick hints that you didn't know you could do in the system. From a help desk perspective, I usually like to see some kind of website that people can go to internally, whether it's an intro website or some kind of a portal. Maybe, like I said, also it could be inside OpenAir. And then make sure that people know how to reach you. OA support at blah blah blah.com is sort of a default email address, and it's a great one because OA support is OpenAir support. I know how to get a hold of people then with that, and have it have a routing or a distribution to the people who are your power users, whether it's centrally or distributed among the different offices, subsidiaries, departments that you have sort of that Tier 1 structure behind. And make sure you have a lot of documentation. Now, the challenge with documentation is it always can be better and it always has to be updated. But if you can get that frequently asked questions down, the frequently asked questions usually don't change a whole lot. It's usually things like the bigger user guides if you change a process, or the organization structure changes. So if you had any screenshots, they're sort of outdated now in the user guides. But frequently asked questions don't often change. So get those frequently asked questions out there, put them in a place where people can reference them quickly, and then keep all of your training materials in your webcasts. If you record websites, or if you record your training, make it available, whether it's inside OpenAir or in some kind of portal where people can click on it and watch it on demand. That will really be a big help for your end users because they'll know where to go for the information. A long time ago, I set up this help desk. It was actually a SharePoint portal where on the right-hand side I had just here are all the people who are supporting it in the different geographies and offices. So these are your go-to people. If you're in, if you're in Denmark, you call so-and-so for your help from a time zone perspective. And then you'll notice I had these different categories. What's new? Sort of an announcement page, a frequently asked questions page. I also was doing tip of the week, which is something we started doing at Top Step here. We were doing tip of the week. We've evolved into doing consulting tips of the week, but soon we'll probably go back to the OpenAir tip of the week. But it gives people that sort of constant engagement of, the system there's care and feeding going on with the system, and I can be an active participant in my own user community within the organization. So give people that ability to see what's going on, communicate frequently and often, and give them the ability to also feed back information to you. Have your user guides clearly identified, and then release management. We usually call when we help you guys with release notifications, I like to call them an OACC, an OpenAir configuration change, and then you put a number behind it. So you can see sort of the series of how many times the system has changed, and the content of those OpenAir configuration changes usually have a lot of detail in it as to who's impacted by the change, what the change is, when will I see it, does it impact any of my reports, is there any action on my part. Okay. User guides, we like to definitely recommend user guides. I do realize user guides tend to be a little larger and more static. Quick reference cards are often a replacement of that, sort of checklists because they're easier to maintain. But have something like that so when you onboard people, they have some place to go to double check and make sure they're learning what it is they need to do in the system. And then of course all of your training materials that you did when you launched the system and updating those as processes change in the organization. The FAQ database, I keep talking about the FAQ database, and they're usually, I can even help you guys if anyone's interested. We can always provide a list of sort of our standard FAQs. The first one is what's OpenAir, and second is when is my timesheet due, type thing. Or third is, when I get the timesheet is approved, do I do anything, with it? So, there's just general questions that we hear people ask all the time that we've developed our own, FAQ database that we share with our customers. And so if you need sort of a starter set of questions, we can always help you with that. Now, release management. I've already talked about the fact that OpenAir does release management. But one thing that you'll want to make sure you do also is internal release management. And I mentioned that earlier, but it's really a way to sort of help people internally know when things are going to change and why they're changing. I think what contributes to, because OpenAir is a system that can be, you check a box, hit save, and suddenly something changes in the system. If people aren't given fair warning, the system looks unstable because one day there's a field there and the one day the field's not there. And then the next day there's a different field and then the day after that it's gone again. So there's always like the what's going on type thing, aren't there any controls in place type feeling. So control change management by definitely having some kind of release management mentality in the organization. Track issues and enhancements that you have submitted over to OpenAir so you can see if those are coming in a release so you can communicate to your end users, hey, we heard you. You wanted some way to organize your reports into folders. The release this time has folders for reports. Yay! And so everyone knows that they're getting listened to. The configuration can change email. I have an example here in this slide. But the configuration change emails are really great. It's a communication method, so it's something that you can post. It's something you can push out. But really what it's meant to do is explain what is changing, why it's changing, and how does it impact you type thing. And for those of you who are on our release management offering or outsourced administration offering, we're working with you by looking at the releases and giving you this type of information. Here's the limitations, here's the dependencies, here's what people need to know type thing. And so this kind of email is something that will help you craft to send out to your end users so they understand why the system's changing and what's changing. Those of you who have worked in other systems, you get this kind of thing all the time. If you use Google Apps or on some other kind of Amazon, they'll send PayPal. They'll send notifications out about change in policy or change in structure or change in functionality. Do the same type of thing, but internally with OpenAir. So just remember, being a guru is more than just unlocking people because they forgot their password. You are actually one of the key drivers of making OpenAir a success and an adopted tool in your organization. You're there to help enforce business process and policy, and you're helping end users have a more positive experience with the system at the end of the day. The documentation is always helpful. Making sure you have some kind of reference area for people to go to is definitely recommended. And standardize as much as you can inside the system so that your life can be actually maintained easier being in that administrator role. Actually out of time. I do appreciate everyone's feedback, input, and of course attending the webinar. We will be at SuiteWorld next month. We do have a webinar, but we will be at SuiteWorld. That's our focus in 4 weeks away. So we hope to see you there, and if you need any passes, we do have passes as a sponsor, so don't hesitate to reach out, and we look forward to seeing you there. So thank you once again for joining and supporting us in this webinar series. Have a great day.
Thank you.